Now, in the literary tradition that a lot of these are drawing upon, it's not actually from fantasy at all. It's from the Black and Native American experience in America. So you end up with, a very, very extensive, very, very extensive, reproductively unseparated population. They're not. I mean, there are plenty of laws, and there are plenty of customs, and there's plenty of censure for the children, but it's not as though this isn't happening all the time. So, still, though, the literature is full of it. I mean, how many Westerns have the half-Indian buddy who happens to be good at scouting and tracking? And all the coolness factors, the character who lives with the white man, but isn't really treated as an equal, but is valued for his funky skills and his insights into the enemy, but who wears a thing. Yeah. Wears like one thing that is indicative of that background. And that is a common image, and any number of fantasy and science fiction, especially in science fiction. You guys know, of course, that Spock, in the write-up for the original series, was not the first officer, but was merely the science officer, and that he was written very briefly. A Martian or something is pretty much the description.
Yeah.
And then after the pilot, when poor Majel Barrett gets screwed out of being number one, and Mr. Spock is made into the first officer as well as science officer for the second pilot. And then in rewatching, I was surprised to see how many episodes went by before half-humanness is brought in. Later episodes cannot shut up about it, as we know, in the original series. But that's really well underway by the time fans are writing episodes.
Well, and isn't the first incarnation, the Martian incarnation, there's some sort of hint of, rather than logical, he's wildly emotional.
Right. Yeah, he's quite an emotional character in the very first time he appears. And exactly. I mean, this is clearly the case of content being shaped through use, as I'm always talking about for a lot of this kind of creativity. Yeah. But in the what I'm driving at, though, is that clearly Spock, as a half Vulcan, becomes, catches fire with the scriptwriters, catches fire with the audience, catches fire with the actor, and just is dominating the series to a very great extent. And so it's very clear that this concept is straightforwardly socially on people's minds all the time. And whatever the divisions are, any crossing thereof with progeny is just going to be hitting people where they live all the time. And so you have a rich history of this with the Westerns and with various civil rights dramas and things like that. And then you also...
a little earlier, Kipling and Kim, right? I mean, that's...
Right, yeah. A good
certainly
example.
A lot of early science fiction cut its teeth on that kind of fiction. So.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. I mean, they're almost... Burroughs and Kipling are, joined at the hip. And I was just thinking of Burroughs, that John Carter's kids, who are half Earthling, half Martian, nobody cares. Everybody just respects them because Carter is so awesome. So it's okay. But the other, I'm thinking, though, with that to draw upon, it's not surprising that we get a certain amount of that just showing up as is in role-playing. What I'm interested in is how much, and where do we start seeing it? Where do we really start seeing it from the sort of incoherent or not very articulated or figure it out at the table thing with the original half-orc? Then you And then also, if you deconnect it from Tolkien, so the whole idea of the evil race is no longer really as fixed. What do we start seeing then? There aren't... I'm thinking of the various races in Talislanta. I mean, basically, almost all of them are half human in Talislanta anyway. Right?
There's a whole set of them that are all they're descended from the Phaedrons by one means or another, but they just don't. There's not like I was looking at that one and just going, why isn't there more about crossbreeding?
Yeah, because everybody lives together in the Seven Kingdoms and everything anyway.
Because you've got such a wide choice. I mean, I'm not quite sure.
Yeah. And then when you go and look at some of the ones that I talked about, which I'm not going to go into in this seminar because I was going to write them up or do presentations about them to keep my research kind of out of the Monday Lab. But just to summarize, I mean, to list them briefly, I talked about Undiscovered with the Dusters and the Half-Dusters. And that's very much an American West setup. And it's interesting because it's unique. There's all these other fantasy races, and there's not even a mention of any such thing. It's just humans and dusters, but it's a big deal. And then you have in Promised Sands, you have all these weirdly altered humans into what are effectively fantasy races. And then you have half-breeds showing up recently among them as their cultures, their various subcultures and cultures bleed and merge and get their hierarchies shaken up, because the book's really good about that and very, very real world about the way cultures work historically. And so in each case, you get the characteristic majority races in that area, region, start showing up. Half-breeds are showing up, and the culture has no idea of what to do with them. That's a big thing. The culture has their perspectives and their psychologies are not none of the cultures have a mechanism to accommodate them. And so, and considering the diversity of the cultures in terms of eating the dead or handling the dead in any way, and in terms of slavery, you can see there's a lot going on in Promised Sands on that precise issue. In fact, one of the authors even told me when I talked to them about this stuff, said, you know what, I always wanted the game to be just about the half-breeds. I just wanted player characters to be half-breeds. I never dared say it to the other authors, but that's what was kind of always in the back of my mind. He said I would never play anything but a half-breed in that game. I thought that was a pretty strong indicator. And then there was the game Dark Earth Legends, which I was extolling, at the Patreon, which really also is very good in terms of how the nominal races, which ones have grown to live together, at least in certain regions, and that both the dwarves and the elves, the majority, have kind of turned their back on the old school elves and dwarves. And now just kind of live with and among humans, maybe not 100% integrated, but quite, ordinary in the places where they're considered ordinary. In those cases, the half-elves and the half-dwarves, each with humans respectively, are a thing. They're there. It's just kind of also cool that the half-dwarves, the common dwarves, kind of the half-orcs, who are the Ongul race, they all get along, especially insofar as they're part of human society. They're kind of like a rough and ready bunch of, not necessarily an underclass, but just a bunch of roughnecks who get along. Whereas the half-elves are always, even though they even the common elves don't get along with the high elves. And the half-elves don't get along with the common elves very well. So all the elves are basically turning up their noses at everybody else. And so they never quite, there's a very different construct of the word true elf in in the setting, then there is a construct of a real dwarf. They're composed of different groups in each case. It's not equivalent. And that's pretty intelligent, as far as fantasy settings are concerned. It's intelligent that the terminology in the points of view of the characters is going to differ by politics, really, historical culture / politics, then it's going to differ by what we would call genetics. So I thought that was pretty intelligent. And then there's that weird one, Ramlar, which is fascinating by its absence, in which you've got the utterly classic fantasy races, skinned in, funky words, but that's what they are. And then there's that weird in-setting mandate, like a mythological mandate that says there will be no offspring. Not even infertile offspring. No offspring. Period. There just aren't going to be. And then that's it. You get the little mythological story, which incidentally makes no sense. And then that's the rule. And you just have to say, well, why did the authors not want that? What's that about? And then there was a couple of other examples that I tossed in as well. But those are the ones I can think of where the authors clearly thought about how do historical populations and cultures encounter this phenomenon, and what do they do with it? And in some cases it seems okay. Nobody thinks twice about a half-dwarf in Dark Earth. They're as tall as people. They look like dwarves. They live with the common dwarves just like common dwarves live with humans. You walk into a bar, there's full of dwarves, one of them's a half-dwarf. Nobody thinks twice. Whereas half-elf over there isn't going to be getting along too well with any of the common elves, and everybody's kind of interested, well, what does he do in human society? What does this guy do? Because I want to know.
Yeah, I mean, as a concept, a half anything as a race of its own just doesn't really make sense, right? I mean, it's not a...
If you're talking about biologically, no, but in culture, that actually is very common, right?
True.
The very word Creole, for example, and there's tons of others.
Yeah, but even then, it's
Scots Irish.
It's not a simple. It's not a simple. You get into you're half and half of something. It's all kinds of, do you have any blood from these side or the other side? All that kind of stuff. And I was just thinking, there's in Pathfinder, current descendant of D&D stuff, they kind of sort of move that way. You can have, orc blood, and you can be a sorcerer from an orc-blooded bloodline, and there's certain benefits you get from that, and you can take traits that let you say, well, yeah, I'm a halfling, but I was raised with humans, so I get a human trait instead of a half. So in both, well, actually, I don't know. As I think about it, if that's really less icky than saying half races and not, because then you get into the question of,
I want to distinguish between us.